Okay. Hi, Susie. How are you?
Hi, good. How are you doing?
Doing fine. Thank you. Thank you for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Douglas.
So, you are a nurse anesthesiologist by trade, is that right?
Yes,
Okay,
yes. I
great.
work in obstetric anesthesia.
All right. And you're also now an author. You've written a book, which we're going to be talking about. Is this your first book?
It is. It's my first book.
Okay. Uh, what inspired you to write the book? I always get asked that.
Well, a whole bunch of things, but I suppose the beginning of it was I had a sister who died of an overdose, and we have a lot of addiction in my family. And I went home for the funeral, and I got back to work, and I was working. I'd put in epidurals and do C-sections and that kind of thing. And I had three women that day on the unit that I put epidurals in who were in active heroin addiction. And I felt sort of almost compelled to do something. So I had started a group for the unit called Recovery Path for Mothers and Others. And then I went back to school and I got my doctorate in coping mechanisms for women. And COVID was happening. And I said to my family, these coping mechanisms are good for everyone. They're not just for people with a diagnosis. And I looked around for a book like this and didn't find it. So we wrote it.
All right, great. Well, I'm sorry to hear about your
Yeah.
sister. Did she also die of heroin?
No, she had an accident in 1981 and it introduced her to narcotics. And so she had a lifelong pill struggle, like a lot of people in this country. She was affected by very liberal pill use through, the 90s was terrible. We were handing out pills like candy. And she just spent her life in a healthcare system, trying to get pills. And eventually she fell into the back issues and ended up going down a really bad road and ended up overdosing.
So this was painkillers, opiates.
Painkillers,
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
over a lifetime.
Yeah, because fentanyl is a huge problem now, although
Oh,
it
yeah.
wasn't so much in the 90s, but it's all the same derivative, right? It's all opioids.
Right,
So,
right.
yeah. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. You mentioned something called coping mechanisms, and it seems to be the theme in your book. Can you explain what that is? What is a coping
Yeah,
mechanism?
so a coping mechanism is a way to a substitution for a substance or something that isn't good for you, right? So we all have days where we, want to binge Netflix and eat a bunch of ice cream and sit in yoga pants and not do anything. And that's fine. I mean, for every day, it's just if you start doing that day after day after day, it's probably not a great thing. And same thing with like drinking a bottle of wine every night or that kind of thing. And what happens to your brain is your brain ends up replacing those dopamine receptors with the need for those poor decisions. So over time, you have less capacity actually to feel not depressed because you have trained your brain to depend on that bottle of wine or that night of Netflix or that bowl of ice cream or huge thing of ice cream or whatever is your thing. And we all do that, but this offers you exercises and not specific exercises and not specific practices, but basically daily advice on how to increase those dopamine levels.
Okay, I know some people find that through exercise, but some people
Hmm.
can't get to the start of that. I know I'm one of those that falls into that trap of just, I hate exercise. I
Yes,
don't mind being
yes,
active, but I hate a regimented exercise. I just won't do it. But if
absolutely.
my wife wants to go and take a walk or something like that, great, I'll go. But so I'm sort of bad that way. What are some of the coping mechanisms that you talk about in your book? Any specific examples?
Oh, absolutely. So what we do is we bust it down to mind, body, and spirit. And what what that means is kind of a demystifying of that and making and breaking it down into its simplest compounds. So we don't talk about this specific part of it, but I'll give you the explanation so that when I start talking about the coping mechanisms, it makes more sense. The the mind portion is sort of decluttering the mind with, uh, uh, any kind of trauma, any kind of, even just like on a daily basis, you take something home from work with you and you hold on to it really tight. And the idea is that you just have to let it go. You have to give it to someone else, give it to a counselor, do what you need to do. And each day sort of gives you a different sort of advice about how to handle minor situations or major situations. So decluttering of the mind is one thing, and that creates a situation where you are able to change. Because without decluttering the mind, you can't be open to change. And then the next thing is the body, and that's the endorphins. And we never say you have to be a size 4. We never say you have to do this exercise regimen. In fact, taking a walk is perfect. You just have to move. You have to do one thing that changes the habits, right? And creates the endorphins that you need, because endorphins are the other thing that everybody seems to know about endorphins because of exercise and food. And then the third thing is the spirit, which we don't like to talk about because it seems very groovy and hippie, and that seems unless you have a specific practice, it's intimidating to people, but it's really important because it's how we quiet the mind. And the literature has a lot of stuff about meditation because you can quantify that, but it doesn't matter what you do. You can pray, you can take a bath with candles, you can do uh, work with crystals, you can do any kind of practice that you want to do. Go to church, whatever it is that helps your ability to quiet the mind. It helps build those dopamine levels, and that's really important as coping mechanisms. So any random day that I pick is going to have, advice about, so say I've been kind of hard on you for like 3 days in a row, we're going to have like take a vacation day. And so that one's like rest a little, because I tend to be someone who overdoes it. So sometimes people need a little bit of advice and help to slow down. Another day is going to be something like, um, allow your mind to change, allow yourself to, again, it has to do with that opening the mind. We're constantly talking about remaining open so that you can change. So it's a cycle. There are 13 sections, and each section has a theme. The first one's gratitude, and each section sort of walks you through mind, body, and spirit, and how to kind of open those things. And you go to the next section, and there's 28 sections. I said 13, but there's 28 sections, and that's just because of the way that the year, 365 days, divided.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So
Yeah.
28 sections of 13 is how that worked out. So yeah, so those are just little things every day to sort of remind you of how to create those changes that create the endorphins and the dopamine that you need to feel good.
Okay, let me shift this just a little bit over to the healthcare system, because I know you talk about that quite a bit on your bio here. And I'm just going to read this one because I thought it was kind of funny. Why we suck as a healthcare system. Now, I certainly agree with you, and we could go on forever with HMOs and with insurance and with all of the red tape and the nonsense. But are you talking about that part of it, or are you talking specifically about the healthcare providers?
I'm much more fundamentally talking about how we provide healthcare, particularly mental health. So substance use disorder, addiction is one of the largest problems in the country, one of the biggest problems in the country. Arguably, if you combine that with mental health, there is not a greater crisis in our country than that. Last 2020, despite all of our talk about COVID, which is important, I'm not saying it isn't, but 2020 had the largest ever in recorded history death by overdose. largest ever. It's
Wow.
not getting better, and we are not doing anything about it. And what's funny is that if you were to Google addiction, you're going to have a list of treatment centers, which is great. You need treatment centers, but you're not going to have any governing body that's going to guide you. Somewhere down around number 7 or 8, you find SAMHSA, which is a government resource. But if you were to say, for instance, Google diabetes, you'd have the American Diabetic Association would be the very first thing to pop up. And there's an organized response when you go to the hospital and you have a blood sugar of 450 and you come into the ER, they know exactly what to do. And they have all of these resources. We have a nutritionist that might meet with your family. You have an endocrinologist. You have you put up on the floor or in the ICU and you have a drip going, and everybody knows how to treat these people. I am telling you, I didn't have any training on addiction in school. I had one lecture, and I give that lecture now. You know what I mean? I'll go to these schools and I'll give these lectures, but it's not enough. Like, we don't know how to treat these people, and it shows. Because if an addict shows up, if someone with substance use disorder shows up to the ER, we try to find them a bed somewhere in some treatment center. I know, but you might not even have, you live in a smaller town, you might not even have that resource. You might not even have the ability to treat these people. So my point about it is that if we looked at mental health the way we look at something like a stroke, for instance, and people would come in and say, hey, it takes months, if not years, to replace those dopamine levels and to retrain the pathways of the brain for someone with substance use disorder or with mental health issues in general to change the way their brain is hardwired. You have to train it, just like a stroke victim needs physical therapy. If we actually looked at mental health as brain fitness, I think we could flip the script on how we treat so many different things, because now you're talking about overeating and weight issues, which affect every system. You're talking about depression, which decreases your ability to fight infections. You're talking about, I mean, if we would treat these conditions as if they were really healthcare issues, then we could actually change everything about healthcare. So fundamentally, we don't even share the interest with the neuroscience behind this. It's really funny because I actually just talked to someone recently who's actually he's in residency now, and he said, well, there's no research about that. I'm like, there is so much research about that. It's in neuroscience, but you're in healthcare, so you are in medicine, so you don't study this stuff. It's not we don't cross over and talk to each other when we look at the research. It's all what you specialize in. So I could go on all day.
Well, it sounds like it, and it sounds like we need to have somebody like you going on all day, because the healthcare system, and I've heard this from other people who have been on the show, that the healthcare system is really flawed when it comes to mental health issues. Now, mental health has had a bad history in this country and in other countries, particularly in the West, where we used to just lock people up in mental asylums and
Right,
subject them to all sorts
right.
of cruel electroshock therapies, lobotomies, insulin shock therapies, just the most horrible things you could think of, right? And then in the
Absolutely.
80s, they sort of closed all of these facilities because of the new psychiatric medications that had come out. But the problem is you've got all these people on the streets now who just used to be locked up, but they were medicated when they were in a facility. They get out on the street, they don't take their medication, and they go back and worse in some cases.
Hmm.
So I mean,
Well, we've become, oh, sorry.
there's a whole nother problem compounded there with not with just
Absolutely.
the system, but the way that the system has forgot about all of these people, and now they're living on the streets.
Absolutely. And we can't just treat mental health with a pill. Like, that can't be the way that we treat it. And that's kind of my whole point, is that it requires a system that responds to the brain chemistry. We could take dopamine levels, we could take all sorts of cortisol levels, we could look at your endorphins, we could actually fix chemistry if we actually cared about those people, but we don't. And we don't even begin to, I mean, we haven't even investigated even remotely the imaging science behind this stuff, which, you know, a lot of people get criticized like, oh, it's crack science. But we haven't, it's not crack science. It's not science. It's science that's uninvestigated. We haven't done enough research to look at this population. And I know exactly what you're saying. It's a desperate situation. Sometimes I think some of those things that, you know, if there was someone, you know, that we see a lot of torture on television, but there are some things that we were thinking about actually treating the patient, you know, treating them, teaching them how to become a functioning person. Now we just hand them a pill and go, good luck. I mean, that's all we do. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, it certainly is. Suzie, unfortunately, we are out of time. We've run over a little bit.
Sorry.
Thank you so much for coming on. Again, your book is, can you want to hold up the cover so we can
I
see
sure
it?
will. It's very pretty. The
Oh, it
Path
is, yeah.
365.
Okay. And it's out now and available?
Yeah, it's on Amazon, and you can follow me on at the Path 365 on Facebook, Instagram. I don't know, all of them. And then it's on my website, thepath365.com.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask you. Give the website again, please.
Thepath365.com.
Okay, super. All right. Thanks so much for coming on. I know we could have gone on a lot longer, but this gives
Thank you so
people
much.
this gives people a nice overview, and hopefully they'll go out and buy the